Hey everyone, this is Aaron with Solitude Springs Farm and Vineyard here in Fairbanks, Alaska. So I want to take a few minutes today and go over maybe some answers to questions that people ask me about attempting to grow grapevines in this area, 65 degrees north. Yeah, I tell people basically at this point that I grow grapevines. We haven't yet succeeded at grapes, but there's a lot that goes into that. So I thought I'd touch on a few of the points that you'll need to know if you're trying to grow grapes in this area. First of all, the biggest function of a grapevine is to obviously store energy, and to do that successfully, it has to grow bigger every year, and then of course produce seeds from that energy. So we're going to look at this vine right here as an example of what's required to do that. Most plants you think of, they die of the ground every year, they come back the next year, they flower, everything's nice and green. But then you look at things like trees and shrubs and stuff like that that actually have woody parts that have to survive the winter. And the grapevines fall into the latter category. They are not herbaceous. So what grows one year will die unless it forms wood along that growth. So it will die all the way back to what was there the year before, and it will never get bigger. And if that happens, you'll never get any flowers, you'll never get any fruit. They're kind of like currants, if you're familiar with those. Currants only bloom on last year's wood. So what grew last year, hardened off, survived the winter, the buds on that growth from last year then have flowers inside. So that's pretty much the way grapes are. They flower only on last year's wood. That's generally correct. There are a few that, obviously there's always exceptions. But so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this vine. So this is what grew this year. It started out very down here at the bottom. It started out, this is last year's, actually this one didn't survive last year. So this is the previous year's growth. This is 2 years ago. And so it grew out this year, grew this nice shoot up to the tip here. And just a clarification here, grapevines generally are either green or red when they're growing, and this just is determined by the amount of anthocyanins inside. It's a protective measure against sun damage and environmental extremes. So some grapevines you won't see this red color to, other grapevines you will. And that's important to keep in mind when you're looking for the characteristics that I'm going to show you here, because some don't follow a particular color pattern when they're hardening off. So what this vine is doing right now is it's saying, okay, days are getting shorter, temperature's getting cooler. It's time for me to start going dormant so that I don't get caught in the first freeze, which for grapevines is about 29 degrees. Because anything that's green at 29 degrees those cells will burst and it'll all be dead. Okay, so this one started to take that turn now. And at the bottom here, you'll see that this is a different color. Up here it was red. Down here it starts to turn kind of a yellowish tan color. And if you look over on this one here, it's even lighter. Generally speaking, they go to a white. Some go very pale white. You'd think it was dying, but it's not. It's getting ready to form this brown layer here, which is basically the epidermal cells on the outside, the skin cells on the outside of this are dying, and they're turning into a corky material that is water resistant, and it's much more rigid than this up here. So this forms the woody material that will hopefully survive the winter and then bud out next year. Parts of grapevine anatomy, these are buds here. This swollen area here is a node. You can see it's slightly larger in this area here than above and below it. These are internodes. Nothing comes out of internodes. Roots will. Roots will come out of internodes, but leaves and new growth generally will not come out of internodes. It only comes out of the buds here. Each bud is actually 3 small buds inside. So there's a primary bud, a secondary, and a tertiary bud. The primaries, which are the ones that break first, have flower clusters and produce the most growth. Secondary buds, which will come out if the primaries are damaged, or some vines just push the secondaries as well as the primaries. Those, on a lot of varieties, do not have flower clusters in them, so they won't produce fruit. Others do have flower clusters, so they will produce some fruit, but it's usually not as much as the primary bud. Tertiary bud never has flowers on it, so it will only produce green leaves, and that's in case the worst damage occurs. The primary buds are lost, secondary buds are lost, the tertiary buds are all that's left. So the vine can continue to live, hopefully. Primary buds, as you would guess, since they have flowers and are the most productive, are the most susceptible to cold temperature damage. Secondaries are less susceptible to cold damage, and tertiaries are least susceptible to cold damage. But that said, there still is a hardiness level to every vine. And then the other thing you have to consider is inside of all of this is the channels that carry water and food up and down. Those have their own hardiness level, and they're generally much less hardy than the buds. So the buds will survive much colder temperatures than the channels inside here. Okay, so what this is doing is it's turning brown on the bottom here. Let me get my notes so I don't forget anything. So that's the goal, get this mature periderm formed so that it can survive the winter. It allows the vine to get bigger, store more energy because it stores energy in the roots and in that the woody sections. So we've got the color going from on this one, red to white to yellow to tan to brown. And the other thing to consider here is that the periderm, you'll notice that this bud right here is actually brown. So that's our hardening off. The bud itself hardens off. The shoot around it also hardens off. And this periderm down here has to extend beyond that bud in order for this bud to be good. And if it only extends to the bud, that bud won't work, because the cambium inside here, the food and water tubes, will be damaged. And so this bud may sprout, but nothing will ever happen. It won't grow very big because there's no connection to it. So the other things that happen during this time when it's forming this brown down here is it's moving water out of the cells, because any water inside the cells can cause the cell to rupture when it freezes. It's moving sugar into the cells and water out of the cells to concentrate like an antifreeze to keep those cells from bursting. Grapevines, interestingly, can move water outside the cells, in between cells, where the water can freeze and it won't necessarily damage anything, but still the vine has to dehydrate. It's very important this vine dehydrate pretty intensely to prevent the water from freezing inside the cells and rupturing the cells, which is what kills it. So there's water out, sugar's in. There's also a process going on of callus forming, which is a material that it's essentially undifferentiated cells, so it doesn't have much of a function by itself, but it clogs those food and water tubes. Specifically, it clogs it here at the bud, it clogs it at the base of a shoot, and it clogs it at the base of the trunk. So there's three places that those build. When those are in place and blocking flow, then no water can get from the roots back up to the plant in the middle of winter and cause these cells to burst. So basically, it's helping dehydrate itself. In order to do that, the ground has to be pretty dry, which we don't exactly have right now. Okay, so that's the callus. This process of doing all this stuff takes about, from the time it turns brown here, takes about 4 weeks from what I've experienced. So basically, this brown has to form here by September 1st. And yes, this plant is doing that this year. It didn't last year. So it's environmental conditions weren't right last year. They are better this year. So what you're looking for on your grapevines this time of year is this brown forming. And it feels rougher than this stuff up here. So that's one way to tell, but it will eventually get, you know, a woody feeling to it. Similar to this down here, but this is shedding bark because it's older wood, so it's shedding its bark. This won't shed this year. Okay, so let's see what else is there. I think, okay, so what are the triggers? So I said something about the temperature, day length, which is an issue here. They're looking for shorter days, decreasing temperatures, nights dropping near freezing. But since this is a temperate climate plant, they are still expecting highs in the 60s and 70s when that happens. Not the case here. Let's see, so what else? We've got maturation, that natural vegetative cycle. Most plants have a range of days that they expect to be alive. So for grapevines, it's typically 150 to 180 days. Most grapevines expect to be alive for that length of time during a typical growing season. So here on our farm, typical growing season is actually closer to 125 days. So a lot of vines simply go into the fall expecting more days. They don't know what's coming, slams, freezes, and they die back. So that's typically what you're going to find on a lot of the varieties that are sold in the stores. The very common ones, ones that are bred for cooler climates, they have a little bit shorter, but most of those are still 140 days. And so it far exceeds what we have here. There are a few species, and I refer to species rather than varieties because, I don't know, there's over, I don't know, hundreds of grapevine species, something like that. There's a lot. You wouldn't believe it. But some of those are more adapted to shorter seasons, such as Vitis amurensis from China and southern Siberia, which we have one. I believe the vegetative cycle on that one is closer to 80 days. They will go longer, but they can't go shorter. So that's something to consider. So anyway, more about, so let's see. Okay, so we've talked about the temperate climate. They're growing 30 to 50 degrees latitude. We're at 65 here, so that's way out of their comfort zone. They want a longer season. Talked about that. They want darkness every day. So most temperate plants expect, 10 hours of complete darkness every day. There are, vines that do okay at the extremes of like 51, 52 degrees north, but they're still getting a significant amount of darkness at night. So grapevines go into the fall here thinking, wow, it's not dark yet. And finally, by the time it gets dark, they start to shut down, but it's too late. So one of the rules that they've kind of come up with for one species of grapes, Vitis ripari, which is often used in the lower 48 breeding programs for cold climates, that has a trigger point of what they say is 14 hours. I question whether it's actually the actual hours of the day, but rather the rate of decrease of the day. So they say 14 hours. I say every day gets shorter by 4 minutes. And the reason I say that is because our 14-hour days don't come until September 7th, I believe. So by rights, riparian vines should not be significantly shutting down until September 7th. I see vines that shut down much before that. So anyway, so they say 14 hours. That's that magical number where they start to think, okay, it is getting close to fall. I need to start shutting down. But that means that their night times are 10 hours minimum darkness, right? So we just don't get that until, like I said, early September. If you look at Montana, early August, they're already at 14-hour days. So these vines have plenty of time down there to harden off. Up here, they simply don't unless they use different clues. You have to remember too, since they're temperate climate plants, they want daytime highs 68 to 90 degrees. Above 90 degrees, they actually shut down, but they like 68 to 90 degrees in that range. We don't generally have a lot of that, especially here at the farm. They say they like soil temperatures in the 60 to 80 degree range. Currently, 16 inches down in my field is 42 degrees. In a good year, dry, warm year, that temperature at 16 degrees down in an open field will reach 55 degrees. Okay. So to give you an idea, roots on grapevines don't grow below 50-ish degrees. So if the temperature in the soil never gets above 50, it will never, ever produce new roots. And I have 5 years of data to show that. No roots, no new growth whatsoever for 5 years the vines were in the ground. If the temperature is not at least 60 degrees, grapevines, the soil temperature, grapevines will not produce flower buds. And that's probably why we have not gotten flowers off of what was our biggest vine. They might grow okay, but they won't produce flowers unless the soil temperature reaches 60 degrees during the summer. If you want full production, it requires at least 68 degrees for a certain length of time, which I don't think I'll ever get, but we can try. And the other thing that disturbs is periderm formation. If your soils are cold, they struggle with periderm formation. And as we've seen, that's very important. As one person I know would say, that's critical. So then they also, during the fall, a lot of places in temperate climates, falls tend to be drier and the soils tend to dry out. That helps them suck the water out of themselves before they form the callus, and that helps to trigger all these processes to go because now they're dehydrated. And so there's less of a chance that the water that's remaining in the cells will burst going into fall. Keep in mind that this periderm formation is only the beginning of cold acclimation for grapevines. This is only the beginning. There's another 2 steps beyond this that actually prepare them to overwinter. So it's a very complex process. So here we have, typically very rainy Augusts. I think this year, in the last 3 weeks, we've had like 7 inches of rain here. So they're not tremendously happy. So I'm actually excited that this one here is actually forming periderm. I have a few others that are. But we generally have the most rain right when they want to dehydrate. So that's a big issue. And there's a lot of environmental manipulations you can do for a lot of these problems. It's just how much trouble you want to go through. Probably the biggest one is soil temperature, to be honest. And that's really the hardest one unless you want to grow them in pots. You can. I have done that. I sink them into holes in the ground over the winter and then pull them out the next spring. They will be limited in size. There will be a lot of work to maintain that way because they really want a big soil mass. I mean, I've seen 15, 20-gallon pots with grapevines growing out of them. They seem pretty happy, but that's a lot to move around, for just what little they'll give you. And so the last thing I want to go over here was that they want a lot more sun intensity than we get. We get, in Fairbanks, we get about 2,000 hours of sunlight a year. Now, granted, our summers our growing season is a lot shorter, and we get a lot of that sun in March and April before they even come out. But we do have the sun hours, but the sun is not very intense. So we have to make up for that. And typically the way that grape growers control that is by, and really it's the sun has to reach this. Part of this process down here is that this shoot matures as a shoot. And so another terminology difference here is that this is not woody, so it's a shoot. This is woody. Once it goes through the winter, it will become a cane. So in order to form the cane from the shoot itself has to mature to a level that requires sun exposure. And in places where it's kind of sun exposure and heat, it's kind of a combination of the two. In places where it's very warm in the summer, you don't necessarily want to pull leaves. In fact, where I'm from, you don't pull leaves because you get sunburned grapes. So you don't pull the leaves. But up here, in order to get the sun exposure and the temperature up high enough to get these buds to mature and actually develop the flower clusters and everything in them fully, they need more sun exposure. So the farther north you go, basically, or the farther south, if you're in the southern hemisphere, the more important it is to pull leaves. And so my experiment this year was pulling them earlier than I have in the past. If you pull them at this time, you're not really helping. I pulled these around July 15th, and that's kind of touchy because you want leaves on here to generate energy and to pump sugars into the plant, because this takes energy to do this. But at the same time, you have to have sun exposure, so it's a fine line between the two. But anyway, I didn't want to get into much of the environmental stuff I manipulate here to get these to go at this point. I just wanted to make it clear what has to happen so that more people can understand what's going on and why their grapevines don't appear the next year, or why they're the same size the next year that they were the previous year when they bought them from the nursery or the store. And again, it is the formation of this woody stuff down here. If this doesn't happen, this whole thing will die back to here, and it will bud out next year again. If it doesn't die in the process because it didn't shut down in time. So anyway, without going into any more detail on that, we'll leave that one there, and we'll go on to a couple more vines here that are in different stages and showing different colors. So let me get up. It's very wet and soggy out here, which is not good. But eventually it'll dry out. Okay, so here's another one. Believe it or not, I think this is a 9-year-old vine. It sat in the field, as opposed to now where it's on a terrace. It sat in the field for 7 of those years. And but there are vines that will survive that long and never get any taller than about this. So you can see it's a lot taller now. Not a whole lot taller, but taller. So it's got periderm forming on the bottom. It has a whiter node here. Again, this is a very dark red color here because of the anthocyanins in it. This vine just grows extremely red. So as you go down here, though, you'll see, if I can get it closer, there's a color change between this red. It's lighter still, even lighter with some lines on it. And then it's turning the periderm down here at the bottom. Okay, so let's go on to another one here that's got more to look at. This one here doesn't necessarily show the lightening up as well. So it went from red to this tan to periderm here, and this has already got periderm on it. So you can't really tell where that delineation is unless you look up here at the really red section. It's actually much redder than, yeah, so you can see the difference in color. Very fine, but in the end, at the end of the season, just before it freezes, you'll be able to rub on it with your finger, and you'll be able to tell where the periderm stops because it's quite rough compared to the rest of the shoot. Or you could wait until it freezes and kills the rest of the vine, and then that's the only part that's not drooping over. So here's another one. This one is green. This one is green. It's got red petioles, but it's mostly green. This one's turning yellow here, and it's got periderm at the bottom here. So you can see the brown down here. It actually has come up over that node, and now it's going to work on the next one. So that's another one there. And then I'll show you one. Actually, this one here. So this is the one that I mentioned before in a post. This is Gewürztraminer, my favorite wine by chance, by the way, if we can say that on here. So this is a Vitis vinifera. This is, Hardy to 10 below at the most. If you look at the base of it, I'm trying really hard this year to get this to harden off. It has in the past, but it's still quite green down there. It is a lighter color of green, but it's still quite green. This one usually waits till September to harden off, so it doesn't do very well. But that is another example of a mostly green, kind of a reddish color to it on the shoots, turning green at the bottom. And then this one over here, the last one we'll go over. This is another one that's mostly green, and at the bottom, this one particularly turns a very white, it's kind of very white. And this down here is, down by my finger there, is very pale color. So you can see it's lightening up. It takes some of these things take a long time to go through this process. But this one here, at the very, very base, is starting to turn brown. So this one will progress up over this bud probably. I don't know that it'll go any farther this year. Another thing to consider too, not to get your hopes dashed too much, but this first bud, generally not fruitful. Most vines, this first bud is generally not fruitful, and what you'll probably see is that the Periderm gets up to about this node here, and it stops for the winter, and then the rest of the cane dies, and you're like, well, I got a bud at the bottom, but that one's not fruitful, so it won't produce flowers. It's only in the upper, generally 2 or 3 for the vines that work here. There's 2 or 3 buds here that have flower clusters in them, and you'll have to have the Periderm form beyond those in order to get those flower clusters to come out. So hopefully this was helpful. This is one step in the process. There's a lot involved in getting these things to flower. Once they flower, of course, then you have to have them flower early enough and then ripen very quickly. And this is one vine that last year showed us it has that ability, but what it struggles to do is harden off in the fall. So, if you don't have that hardening off, no flowers, no berries, it's just a grapevine. Hence why we grow grapevines, not grapes. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the comment section below. I'll post this to Facebook and YouTube, so just thought I'd try and shed some light on the process of growing dark for the winter. Thanks for watching.